Orpheus and Eurydice. Calliope.
Gods and mortals must all know the balance between life and death. They are absolutes. They are rules that cannot be bent or broken. And yet how we all wish it were not so. But for life, there must be death. My son learnt this lesson. This is the tale of Orpheus, my mortal son, but divine in his musical arts. He tried to cheat death itself. Orpheus was fathered by no ordinary man. Oeagrus, a king of Thrace, is thought to be the father of Orpheus, for that is what the court believes. But Apollo took the form of that mortal man, and together we made Orpheus. Apollo himself taught him to play. The mastery of music Orpheus held was beyond that of mortal prowess, but that is to be expected as the child of a muse and the child of a god of music. Mortal men may play beautiful music to take one's breath away, or move tears to fall upon cheeks, but no mortal has ever been able to match the playing of Orpheus. His skill started first with small birds, creatures in the woods in which he'd practice. All were drawn to the sweet noise. As he improved under my guidance, he learnt to sing verses, compose his very own music. Coupled with the tutoring of Apollo, he grew beyond our expectations. It was natural for him, easy, effortless, simpler than learning to walk. In fact, musically, it was as if he had stood one day and could suddenly dance with elegance whilst all around would stumble and fall. And I, Calliope, the muse of eloquence and epic poetry, was so proud of my son. He had become a musician and artist of well-renown. Mortals and animals are both drawn to the power of his strings and songs. A mortal child, but with talent to match that of the very gods. He was raised near Thrace, where he spent his days charming birds and fish. He calmed the aggressive moods of any angry beasts that crossed his path. The foolish mortals all gossiped that my son's songs would never charm the beasts without his golden lyre. They'd all swear in jealousy that Orpheus's only gifts were given to him by Apollo. The magic of the golden lyre is not his power. It is all him. It is all my son himself. Orpheus's songs themselves were the true magic. The man behind the instrument, not the instrument itself. No one knew this better than Eurydice, an Olonid of the valleys and vales. The young nymphs were all drawn to the sweet, soft songs of Orpheus. Sounds were carried on the wind, such songs that you would not believe if you had heard it. The awe it inspires. Yet the nymphs in the meadow couldn't quite hear all the music. Eurydice heard but pieces of the melody Orpheus was composing, and still she was so drawn to it. She couldn't help but seek it out. She followed the sounds of strumming strings and the call of a voice without form through the trees. Her heart began to pound as she drew closer, imagining the soul that the voice belonged to. When she finally broke from the tree line into a golden sunlit clearing, she saw him. Orpheus, his eyes bright and his lopsided smile. As he looked up at her, her eyes became wide with shock. But then the brown irises softened and warmed as she took in his appearance. Enamored with one another from first sight, they met in that clearing often from that day on. He fell for her beauty, but also the way she saw the world. The beauty in her perspective, the differences in their sights, and her constant curiosity. She inspired him endlessly, as he did her. New songs and melodies, verse and chords. The more she heard, the more reverence she felt for him. The pair fell deeply in love. Soon they planned a wedding to bind them together, for they could no longer bear to be apart, looking forward to the future with hope. The wedding of my dear son Orpheus and his Eurydice began with that hope still high. They did the usual ceremonies, but mortal couples rarely have gods blessing their union. Hymneos, a youthful winged god of love, one of the Erots. He is god of the wedding hymn. He came to light a ceremonial torch to bless the couple. But try as he might, the torch would not stay lit. Hymneos turned grave of expression then, warning of an ill omen. He said with a heavy heart that although their love be true, their happiness is doomed not to last long. But Orpheus and Eurydice simply smiled at one another, too happy to let an ill omen scare their joy from them. There was a feast with music, dancing, and to no surprise, Orpheus played and sang some of the many love songs he had written for Eurydice. When the night came and the drinks had been flowing, Eurydice had danced with her dryads and Olunade companions, but had taken a moment to catch her breath. Celebrations had been going for hours. She wandered into the shadows and down away from the crowds. There, drunken in the bushes, was Aristaeus, a hunter. He had always admired Eurydice's beauty from afar. There in the shadows, he tried to grab her, to kiss her pretty face. Eurydice slipped from his grasp and ran from her attacker. She tried to find her way in the dark, to get back to her husband. Through the trees, through the field she ran, branches snapped underfoot, the rush of the river, snap, and Eurydice cried out as the branch underfoot lashed back. Her eyes dropped from the light on the horizon to stare at the viper latched onto her leg, its teeth sunken deep into her calf. She screamed again, but it blended into the roars of the crowds, for Orpheus had finished another ballad, and the wedding was wild with noise. Aristaeus ran stumbling from the collapsed Eurydice. She wrenched the snake from off her body, weeping as blood and venom ran down her leg. The poison set in quickly, racking her body with pain. She crawled towards the wedding lights in the distance and began screaming for Orpheus, pulling herself forward as her body seized up. She called his name, but she was not loud enough, could not get close enough. Her cries became parts of the crowds of adoring fans as Orpheus continued to play songs for his wedding guests. By the time the fires were burning out and the feasts were settled in everyone's bellies, Eurydice was long dead and cold. Orpheus found her, stiff and pale in the grass. Her skin was so cold he flinched when he touched her. Her beautiful brown eyes, glassy and lifeless, the soul completely gone from the shell that held it. Oh, how Orpheus howled at the tragedy. Screams that sounded like the splitting of a soul. After that, he could not eat. He would not sleep. He lay with her cold body for a full day. He could not believe the truth. When he finally turned from her and picked up his lyre, it was too much for any soul to bear. Mortal and immortal alike were driven to tears for the beautiful grief. I summoned the leader of my sisters, the muses. I summoned his father, hoping Apollo would get through to Orpheus.
My son, his skill unmatched even by me, but now he could play of only heartbreak, death, and loss. Each song with some tragic end, with his lyre in hand, and the audience is influenced by his harmony. And so, the masses felt his pain, his anguish becoming theirs with each chord and verse. None could contain their own emotions, their joys and sorrows, for Orpheus's pain was planted in each listener. None could escape the pain in each plucked string. It pierced us all. It became too much, and Calliope called me to guide the boy. Nymphs, satyrs, and the mortals that heard Orpheus's odes all began to ask the gods, pleading us to help the young prodigy, the virtuoso's heart that bleeds. I should have gone sooner, but what can I say? I walked to the boy, sat with his lyre in the meadow. In his grieved moods, he was changeable. As I suggested time, he grew angry. I reassured that time would help heal, and he would soon forget and love again. But he blew up in rage. He cursed Thanatos, the great god of death. He cursed the underworld gods, and Hades himself, for keeping Eurydice from him. He cried that he did not want to forget a moment, and that he would make the world remember her. He would fight for her if need be, if only I were to help him, to lead him to the underworld. But I confessed plainly, I had no way to bring him there, and he should not resort to violence. For Orpheus was so skilled in his music that his songs were able to accomplish impossible feats. Why not go to the gods that hold that power? Why not try to win them himself? His lyre would win more hearts than his fists may do, and so I summoned Hermes, the messenger god known to work with the underworld, ferrier of souls to the underworld. Orpheus and I set out to Olympus to find the winged-footed messenger. He sat in the crowds at court, but he had delivered Eurydice's soul to the underworld himself. He had heard the songs of Orpheus, and gladly he led Orpheus to one of the portals on earth, a doorway between the living and the dead, a way into the underworld. Deep down inside a cave, a jagged wall that shifted in the eyes of Hermes, Orpheus walked towards the wall, following Hermes as they both slipped past the invisible barrier and onto the grey shores of Hades. It is not often living mortals come to my domain, so when Hermes brought Orpheus onto the shores of my realm, I knew I could feel him.
After hearing his songs, after receiving the soul of Eurydice, we were both curious of Apollo's singing son. Together we watched to see how far the mortal would go for his love.
Yes, my dear, we let him try his luck with the many guardians and barriers to our realm. The first being Charon, the ferryman crowded with souls. His boat atop the river Styx, its thick dark waters distracting the mortal soul, as he stood among the dead on the black sand shores.
Once Orpheus noticed Charon, he fumbled for his coins. He paid the ferryman his fee, 2 gold pieces. Charon drew back his arm, welcoming the mortal to his ship. His dark hood covered his face. Orpheus was glad to be on the ship as he turned to look upon the wide expanse of shades and souls of the dead, as they gathered on the black sandy shores, all waiting and hoping for their turn to enter the lands of the underworld. Onward this mortal went in Charon's boat, across the river Styx, across the river Acheron, until they came to the shining gates of adamant, built to keep the dead in and the living out. Our enormous 3-headed hound, Cerberus, our mighty guard, ever watchful and fiercely loyal. He had never failed us before. But Orpheus had planned for the beast. As they approached, he began to play. A slow and gentle song, calming, soothing the waters of the river below them. With the water becoming stiller, Cerberus's ears perked up at the sound. His heads all turned to look at the golden lyre and the dark-haired man playing it. The steady rhythm distracted the dog as his eyes began to droop. The louder the sound, the closer it got, the more powerful its effects. As Cerberus's eyes fluttered closed, and he tried to snap them open again, but 2 of his necks went slacker and then became limp. Sweet Cerberus tried his best to fight the lullaby, but the pup was snoring by the time Orpheus reached our shoreline. This mortal only became more impressive to us both.
Onward he went through the asphodel meadows and field of mourning, past the place of the kings of hell, and where they make their judgments, past rivers and lakes like Lethe, with its waters that make you forget, past the tower of the Erinyes, the Furies. He even glimpsed our Elysium fields. He journeyed until he was at our palace doors.
He quaked as he entered our palace. A look of shock stayed fixed on his face. Mortals expect doom, gloom in the dark underworld beneath the earth. But they forget. Hades is also god of the treasures found in the deep underground. The beauty of gems and gold, just lying under the soils. They never expect the grandeur, the colours, and the light of the palace of the underworld. He walked into our throne room, and it was written on his face. He was afraid. Pain, apprehension, but also a spark of hope. He bowed before our thrones lowly, before beginning his plea. He told us of the tragic death of his wife, how he longed for nothing but her. Then he pulled out his golden lyre. There had never been silence in the underworld, but from the first few notes of Orpheus's lyre, everything was quiet, as if the whole underworld were holding their breath for his song. As he played, he then began to sing. The spirits stopped their walking and their wailing. The Furies stopped their torments. Even the worst souls in Tartarus were stopped. Their eternal punishment paused for his song. All that heard it wept at the love at the heart of the song. And the contents? It was about us, Hades and Persephone, Our story. Apollo or Hermes must have provided the details, for he didn't get a single one wrong. He sang of the strange beginning, but then the growing of love, learning of one another, the building of trust, and the passion that holds us together still. When Orpheus finally finished, he looked up to find the souls in the court, weeping. Hades and I turned to each other, tears and love in our eyes. We took each other's hands and turned our attention back to Orpheus. With a flick of his hand, Hades summoned the spirit of Eurydice to stand before us. Her soul flickered to life like a match in a pitch-black room, translucent, a shadow of her former self, yet Orpheus could not see her with his mortal eyes. Hades gestured for Orpheus to approach and said,
"You have proven your worth, silver-tongued boy. You have snuck into my realm and made your way to my palace unhindered, my guard dog bested, and yet the song you sang of my own love was the most beautiful thing to grace our realm in a long time. For these reasons, I see fit to grant you what no mortal has been given before. You may leave this realm with your wife following you behind, where she may join you in life once more. But only if you walk ahead of her, never turning back, never looking upon her, not once. If you can lead Eurydice's soul back under this condition, when the light of the sun hits both your faces when you pass this realm into the next, Eurydice will be restored back to life."
Orpheus broke into a smile, his eyes bright and wide. With glee, he swore to do as we commanded, and he immediately began to march out the throne room of Hades, the spirit of Eurydice following straight behind. "Husband, if Orpheus is successful, surely more mortals will come, hoping to revive a loved one themselves." Hades turned to me, with a sad smile on his face.
"Love will be his downfall, but I wish to give him the chance. I know it will end as I have anticipated, but he has lost one son already. I do not wish him to lose another."
I watched Orpheus to understand what Hades had meant. Orpheus was determined at first. He started his journey strong, kept his eyes fixed to straight ahead, and he stuck to his path. He never turned or called out to her while in the fields and meadows. He seemed terrified to even turn his head. But people forget that the realm of Hades is vast, and the journey takes a long time. As he walked past the lakes and rivers, alongside souls of the dead, the shades and spirits that wandered, as he looked upon them, doubts began to fall. Orpheus noticed there was no shadow cast on the floor by his beloved, who followed behind. He listened for her footsteps, but heard only the tread of his own. He called out her name quietly at first, but it grew louder. As he grew more desperate, he began to beg for a sign, a sound, anything. But she did not respond. The further he went, the more his patience seemed to falter. He tried to listen for her breathing, anything to affirm that she was really there. For any could see. He was unsure of the word of Hades, half believing it to be a cruel trick to banish him from the realm quickly. His eyes betrayed him. He may have kept his head fixed on the space ahead, but how his eyes darted, shifted, and leapt to the peripheral edges of his sight. He wished for just a glimpse, a flash of evidence that his love was there. But he controlled himself, shaking his head, marching on. He held his restraint well, but with the doubt in his mind, it continued to grow. Hope his unwavering strength in those moments. He approached the gates of adamant once more, and took out his lyre to play. He sang of Eurydice, his love for her and everything about her. Cerberus was lulled gently back to sleep. But as he finished his lullaby, Orpheus faltered, suddenly tripping over the lyrics, the colour of Eurydice's eyes. The question in his mind, were they truly brown or green? Or were they blue or grey? He could not remember. He could not resist. His head snapped round to see her, but his senses caught him in time. Holding himself back, he snapped his eyes closed before he could glimpse a thing. But his poor human mind only added to his torment, for forgetting her face and voice made the challenge nigh impossible. I think I see what Hades had meant. He climbed upon Charon's boat and fixed his eyes on the horizon once more. He tried to build back his confidence, but paranoia had wrecked it. It was not a long journey left, he tried to remind himself. Charon's boat hit the other side of shoreline, and Orpheus sprinted from the boat. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, until he suddenly stopped. There he waited, panting and breathing, as if remembering his wife Eurydice would need to catch up behind. He waited long after she had already caught up, but of course, he could not see her. He took a shaky breath and walked on, toward the waiting cave. Orpheus went down into the cave and up toward the tunnel, the jagged rock wall that thinned between realms. His human eyes able to see the portal as if it were a window to the living. The sunlight of Earth, just out of reach. As he crossed the invisible barrier and felt the sunlight warm his face, a burst of victory rung out in his chest, and he whipped around eager, his heart racing, sweat from the journey on his brow and rapid, shallow breaths. Orpheus turned, and there she was, Eurydice in all her glory, glowing with her thick brown hair and deep brown eyes. Orpheus reached his hand out to take hers, but it passed straight through, for she was still bathed in shadow, her image translucent to see. She was still inside the underworld. Orpheus screamed out, "No!" and began to beg for forgiveness, begged her not to leave him. He tried to grab at her smoke-like arms, but could find no purchase. He tried to step back into the underworld, but could not. Eurydice's spirit hushed him gently, and placed a hand he could not feel upon his face. She whispered to him. She would not forgive her Orpheus. She would not feel any regret. For what did she have to regret? She knew then that she was loved, that he had truly loved her, as she had loved him. Her image faded into the darkness, as her spirit was trapped, wrenched back, pulled into the deep underworld once more. She appeared in our meadows, walking and waiting for when her love would join her. And Orpheus was trapped without her in the mortal realm. But Orpheus had some adventures in the land of the living before finally joining her in the lands of the dead, even helping Jason and becoming an Argonaut. But that is a tale for another time.